A skill that is often given lip service but rarely taken seriously is the art of listening. Listening seems like it should be a simple and basic skill as human beings. But listening is something that I believe is extremely difficult due to precisely because of our humanity. More exactly, I think our brains are designed in such a way as to broadly categorize things in order to make meaning out of the world. I talk more about this in some other videos, but I'll take a little time to explain what I mean here. I'm about to get on what might seem like a tangent, but try to follow along because I think it's the basis of why listening is important and not natural to us as human beings. We are creatures with perceptions that require we focus on one thing at a time. And since there are millions of things that we could be focused on at any given time, we have to be able to decide what is the most important thing. That means the majority of what our brain and our senses do is decide what not to pay attention to. Another thing we do because of the magnitude of information we receive every moment is place things in lumped categories. This is really helpful when you think about survival. Let's say you're a friend of Abraham in 3000 BC, you live in a tent and take care of various livestock. Well, along comes some kind of large cat that's trying to eat your flock of sheep. Our bodies are designed to respond to situations like this with what's commonly known as fight or flight response. Well, that fight or flight response is initiated by seeing this large cat. But really, it's not that this large cat is specifically what causes this within Abraham's friend. It's past experience that causes this fear and this flight or fight response. Abraham's friend knows that this large cat is an animal which could harm his sheep and could harm him. And so really, this large cat is in the broader category of animal which harms. Our brains are designed in a way that we respond the same way to anything which falls into the category animal which harms. And this helps us survive and not get killed, because you'd rather be safe than sorry. Now that you're thoroughly confused as to why we are talking about this hypothetical Abraham's friend person, let me try to tie it back into why listening is so hard. As we've seen, our brains are great at broadly categorizing things for survival purposes. But because we are so adept at broadly categorizing things, we tend to struggle with nuance and individuality. If you've had a bad experience with, let's say, a Quick Trip employee who you felt was very rude, it is easy for our brains to categorize Quick Trip employees as rude. This is what we might call a stereotype, and it's really easy for our minds to fall into this trap. A great example of this within Christian circles is the term atheist. And it's really easy to just reduce someone to this one-dimensional version of what an atheist believes. But within the category of atheism, there are many forms in which it manifests itself, and many various reasons for the conclusions. What authentic listening does is suspend this broad categorization scheme and says, well, how can we actually suspend this categorizing? That's what we're going to explore in the rest of this video. The two major things you can do is practice active listening and constantly utilize a subset of active listening called empathy. What is active listening and why is it important? Well, the name active listening honestly is a bit redundant. Truly listening to someone is to be active. I think an accurate way to express it is hearing versus listening. Hearing is when you just hear that someone said something or hear that some sound was made. You don't really have any comprehension of what that actually means and how it affects your life and what you should do about it. Listening is where you direct your attention towards something and actively seek to gain understanding about that thing. The dictionary definition of listening is actually quite instructive. Take notice of and act on what someone says, respond to advice or a request. So listening has this idea of activeness embedded within it. With that distinction in mind, I will continue to call what I just defined as listening, active listening, for clarity's sake. So why is listening important? I would like to make a quick note and point out that listening is the other half of communication. I made the claim earlier that listening is not something we generally care about in our culture. I think this is illustrated well by the fact that we have entire programs designed for communicating and speaking better, but there is rarely a class devoted entirely to listening. And when we consider the idea that listening is the other half of communication, it seems crazy to me that we don't spend more effort on honing this skill. Listening is a skill that is neither inherent nor easy. You may think that you actually are a really good listener and don't really need any improvement on your listening skills, but I would ask you to consider, when was the last time you had an argument that went south with a loved one or a close friend? Were you listening well in that situation? Did you empathize well with that person? I imagine many of us would answer these questions with, no, not really. Listening connects us with others. It helps us understand another person's perspective. Another advantage of listening is that we may be listened to as well if we first take time to listen to that person. I also believe listening makes you a better leader. If you can't empathize and understand the people around you that you're trying to lead, then it is going to be very difficult to get them to follow you. The final benefit of listening is that it can help us resolve conflicts and solve problems. If both sides of an argument are speaking, then only 50% of communication is happening. And really, it might as well be 0%. So the basic underpinning of active listening is unconditional positive regard for the person speaking. This doesn't mean you agree with everything the person says. It simply means you recognize that person has inherent value. Active listening assumes that the person speaking has the greatest understanding of their own feelings and perspective on the situation at hand. So up to this point, we've talked pretty extensively about what listening is and why it's important. Furthermore, I've mentioned empathy multiple times without fully defining it. So before we get into some basic strategies for active listening, I'd like to address what empathy is and is not. The very core of empathy is to suspend the self. Unfortunately, most people are more likely to react with their own interpretations of another's point of view than to listen carefully enough to make certain that they understand. This means you take your thoughts, beliefs, and preconceived ideas and place them to the side. Nichols, the writer of The Lost Art of Listening, makes the point that, unfortunately, most people are more likely to react with their own interpretations of another's point of view than to listen carefully enough to make certain that they understand. Empathy is a deliberate act to suspend one's own needs and reactions. Empathy is often confused with sympathy. Sympathy is generally seen as having a feeling of pity toward a situation or having a mutual feeling about something. Empathy, however, is about acceptance. To empathize, you must accept how someone says they feel about a situation. To sympathize is to have the same feeling about something, but to empathize is to understand someone else's feelings, even if you don't feel the same way. When you empathize, you listen with the intent to understand and not the intent to reply. Nichols also says, to really listen, you have to suspend your own agenda. Forget about what you might say next, and concentrate on being a receptive vehicle for the other person. You must accept that how they feel is how they feel. It may not be how they should feel, but it is how they are describing how they feel, and you must accept that. Again, this does not require agreement, just acceptance of someone else's perceptions. With this understanding of empathy, let's discuss some strategies of active listening. Again, some of these may seem straightforward, but it is one thing to know what these strategies are. It is a whole separate issue of actually implementing these strategies in daily conversation. First, pay attention. Sure, this seems obvious, but it is quite difficult to maintain attention. The hardest part of listening, I believe, is the voice and thoughts that are within our own minds. So what you need to recognize is that thoughts will come into your mind, and you need to recognize those thoughts have entered your mind and let them go. One of the traps that's easy to get sucked into while listening is that someone reminds you of something and you begin to hold that idea in your head and then totally ignore the rest of what that person says. So thoughts will come into your mind, and you need to let them go. In, out. Got it? This is a really tough one. Another aspect of paying attention to someone is do not multitask. I talk more extensively about this in another video, but multitasking is not a thing. At best, you may be quick at jumping back and forth between tasks, but multitasking is not something humans are capable of. We are able to give our attention to one thing at a time, and when we are truly listening, our attention is devoted to the other person. The next major strategy is to hold making judgments about what a person says. This is connected to the first tip, which states that you need to let thoughts come into your mind and let them go. You need to be open to new ideas and perspectives if you're going to hold your judgment. And really, if you wait until the person has said everything they want to say and you've taken time to ask clarifying questions, you'll be in a much better place to make a decision about what you think about what they're saying. This idea is also connected to the idea that as humans, we tend to broadly categorize people. Just because someone says that they are an atheist doesn't mean you understand their position. Listen to what is unique about their perspective. This also respects the speaker. An important aspect of holding judgment is practicing empathy. Finally, in order to hold your own judgment, it requires you to be patient, not to jump the gun and start firing off your thoughts or preparing what you have to say before they are even done talking. This is not an easy thing to do. The next strategy I'll briefly touch on is reflecting your own understanding. Reflection is just paraphrasing what the person has said in order to first show your understanding, and second, give the speaker a chance to clarify what they've said. Proper reflection requires that you hold judgment. Don't place what you think the person is getting at. Put what they've said in the simplest way possible to express understanding. The cousin to reflection is clarification. When you clarify or go deeper into what someone has said, you want to ask open-ended questions. What's an open-ended question? What I just said is an open-ended question. There are two types of questions, open and closed. A closed question elicits a binary response, generally yes or no. So your friend says, "Then the guy says to me, I'd need to call back another time. Some people have got some serious nerve." If you were to reply, "Did that make you mad?" you were forcing them to say yes or no. Really, their feelings may be more nuanced than just mad. Plus, you're adding ideas into their mind that may not have been there in the first place. The open-ended question is the proper response. An open-ended question would sound something like this: how did that make you feel? This gives the power and control back to the speaker. It allows them to take time to tell you what they felt without having ideas placed into their mind. Open-ended questions are characterized by their simplicity and by the words what and how. Here are a couple of examples. What are you learning from your first few days here? How has living in the dorms been for you? This gives no real parameters for how you expect them to answer. It allows for interpretation of the speaker to answer how they see fit. A good rule of thumb when forming questions is to recognize that complicated questions produce simple answers, and simple questions produce complicated answers. Now I think is a good time to address some possible barriers you may run into when you try to actively listen. Don't feel like just because you don't express your thoughts to them that you are somehow assenting to what they say. It's tempting to clarify your position on something, but good listening doesn't require that. The other major barrier is to give bad responses. Here's a quick list of responses that should be avoided. Don't feel that way. This discounts everything that person says and makes them feel as though somehow they've done something wrong. This also may cause the person to feel as though they have to defend their feelings. This is not an empathetic response. That reminds me, this one is terrible because it can easily make the person feel unheard. Furthermore, it may sound like you're trying to one-up them. Oh, how awful. This is a response that may be tempting to give part of the way through someone's thought. If you say, oh, how awful, but it turns out the thing was actually kind of a positive point, all you've done is 1, told the person how they should feel, and 2, interrupted the story. Well, if I were you, is another common response. This may sound empathetic, but bottom line is that you are not them. Telling them what to do isn't going to change anything. If they ask for advice, then maybe this response is appropriate. I hope this helps you in your daily interactions with those around you. Take some time to listen to a stranger. Try not to interrupt your loved one when they are speaking. Accept what someone expresses about their feelings. Active listening is one of the most powerful aspects to good communication. When you actively listen, you respect and value those around you. It communicates that you care about the individual. Thanks for listening. Until next time.